display block versus display inline versus display inline block. That's what this video is going to cover. I'm going to first give you a description of display block, display inline, and display inline block. Then we're going to look at some kind of differences between them. And then we are going to get into an example here of the different differences and show them kind of live in our web browser here. So first off, what is display block? Well, in CSS, you can set a display property. And when you set this to display block, an element is going to be a block element. Now, what does that mean for an element to be a block element? Well, it means that if an element is display block, it will start on a new line and it will take up the whole width of your document starting at that line. So if you have 3 elements that are display block, those are going to be stacked vertically, one on top of another in your web page. And like this says here, each one is going to start a new line and it's going to take up the whole width of that line. Now, if your property is set to display inline, or an element by default is just an inline element. So some elements are going to just by default be a block level element or an inline level element. So that's something to keep in mind if you're seeing some of these differences behaviors. So like a span element is an inline element, to whereas a div element is a block element. But you can quickly do a Google search on the element to see what its kind of default behavior is. But for display inline, it's going to display the element as an inline element, meaning it's going to stack the elements kind of in the same line or inline to each other and stack them horizontally to each other. All right. So if I have 3 inline elements, it's going to stack them all in the same line, hence inline, and they're going to be stacked horizontally next to each other within your document. This will make more sense when I show you the example here in a sec. Now, one kind of key thing to remember about an inline element is that any height and width properties will have no effect on an inline element. The same thing will be true for margin top and margin bottom, as well as padding top and padding bottom. You can set these properties on these elements, but they're not going to have any effect. It's not going to be respected, so to speak. All right, so an inline element in CSS, it's going to stack your elements horizontally in the same line. The height and width properties are not going to have any effect. Same thing with margin and padding top and bottom. Now for a inline block element, well, it's going to stack these elements in line, meaning it's going to stack these horizontally within your document. However, you can set a height and width to these elements and it will respect those properties. So it's kind of a mix between inline and inline block, in which you can still set properties like you can on block elements like height and width and margin and padding, but it stacks these elements in line like an inline element. All right, so it has kind of the stacking of an inline element, but it has the CSS properties, or it respects them like a block element. Now, let's just kind of go over the key differences between inline block and everything else. So an inline block element compared to an element set to display inline, the major difference is that the display inline block element will allow you to set the width and height on an element. And then with that, it also respects the top and bottom margins and padding as well. So it still respects kind of block level CSS properties. But compared to display block, the major difference between display block and display inline block is that inline block does not add a line break after each element, and it will stack the elements horizontally and the elements will sit next to each other. Whereas display block, it will stack them vertically and add a line break after each element. All right, so let's now look at this example here from W3 Schools, a great resource as well for just a lot of good information here. So let's look at kind of what we've got going on here. So these top 2 elements, they are going to be these spans. So they're going to be display inline. And then these middle elements here are going to be inline block elements. And then these bottom 2 are going to be display block. Now, what you can see over here is me styling these with CSS here. And you can see that this one's set to display block, this is display inline block, and this is display inline. And as you can already see some of the key differences here, this display block level elements, well, it stacks these vertically over one another. And this element here, it takes up all the space of this document, and then it adds a line break, and then it adds the next block level element. So display block, it's going to stack these vertically. And then you can also see that a width and height is set on these properties here, and it respects that. It makes these 100 pixels times 100 pixels. And then if we move to the inline block, well, we set the width and height here, and you can see it's the same size as my display block, so that's also being respected here. But you can see that these are stacked horizontally next to each other within the line. All right, so it still respects those CSS properties, but they are in line next to each other. And then if we go here to just inline, you can see that I'm still setting a width and a height property, but it's not respecting those properties anymore. Those have no effect on an inline element here. But just like my inline block element, you can see that these are stacked next to each other within the line. Now, what's going to happen here if I add padding bottom to my inline element? Well, as I said earlier, it's still going to set the padding, but it's not going to respect it. So here you can see that it still adds this padding to the element, but you can see that it still has overlap here. Like, it's not respecting the padding. See how these letters right here are not respecting the padding of this element? That's because the padding really has no effect. And the same thing is true if I add any margin to this element as well. It will still technically have the margin on this element, but it doesn't add any extra margin here. However, if I were to add some more margin to my inline block element, you should see that it pushes these letters down a little bit more. So if I go ahead and I do margin bottom and add 20 pixels to that, you're going to see that it does push those elements down a bit more. So with an inline block level element, it still is going to respect that margin top, margin bottom, padding top, padding bottom, as well as the height and width, in which in an inline property, it's basically just going to ignore width, height, margin top, margin bottom, padding top, padding bottom. All right. But the inline and inline block, they both stack elements horizontally here, but display block, it respects all the properties like you would expect, but it adds a line break after each element and stacks them horizontally. So hopefully this example helps you kind of see the differences a little bit more clearly on how these work. Thanks for tuning into this. Make sure to subscribe for more web dev tutorials, and I will see you in that next one.